This is the first of a two-part series that I have planned for Flatland. This one talking about the novella, and the second one talking about the questionable movie adaptations. The next video is scheduled to be posted one day after this one goes live, so make sure to come back for the whole story. But with that being said, I believe I promised you guys in my last Book of Bill video a proper video on the novella Flatland. However, during my scripting of this video, I thought to myself, I'm going over the novella, so why not look back at the two films that I've watched? I do have a degree in film, and I barely get to use it after all, so why not? Why shouldn't I put what I spent 4 years learning to good use? However, over the course of watching the two films I remember, I came to 3 kind of startling realizations. The first being that there actually exist 4 Flatland films, 2 of which being shorts that I had never watched before or even knew existed. The second being that my initial idea about one of the films being very bad was actually kind of misinformed. And the last being that some of you in the comments section of my last video have no taste whatsoever. So buckle up, because I have no idea how long this will be. Let's go and delve into a fairly comprehensive look at Flatland, a romance of many dimensions and its related media. Hey, hi-yo out there to all my big brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles, and of course, mommies, daddies, siblings, and guardians. It's me, your bite-sized fatty and favorite little brother Mark. So, what is Flatland? Flatland, a romance of many dimensions, just shortened to Flatland, is a short story/novella written by Edwin Abbott and released in 1884 that centers on the struggles of a square coming to terms with the existence of the third dimension. As a whole, the story is a satirical commentary on how the Victorian English society that Abbott was a part of functioned, oppressed its people, and was prone to folly. One may expect that to result in heavy backlash after the paper's publishing. But truthfully, a story must first be received at all to be ill-received. Abbott's entry in the Dictionary of National Biography produced for notable people who died between 1922 and 1930 didn't even mention the novella. Being a theologian, schoolmaster, and even priest himself did not seem to grant Abbott nearly as much sway as he wrote about in the book. Ultimately, his writing was only added after Einstein's theory of relativity popularized the idea of a fourth dimension, bringing the novel into prominence. In present day, this story is heralded as an innovative discussion of multidimensionality, being one of the first texts to ever propose the idea of the fourth dimension as a concept, and that beings of higher dimensions could be able to manipulate those below them. Though, while that is true, the importance of the story stretches far beyond that in a way that many seem to either forget or flat out ignore. This is a story that, through absurdist extremes, directly demonstrates how discrimination is the downfall of society and only serves to keep all raised within a prejudicial system down. That might sound silly when discussing a novella about literal shapes come to life. However, I believe you'll be able to see what I mean as I go into the story's details. Speaking of, let's first talk about how the book itself functions. Since I have you here, I want to really quick just squeeze in a thank you to my Patreon supporters. I would not have been able to make this two-parter series without you guys, so I really appreciate it. At my brother, sibling, sisters tier, Box Kit, Ash Valentine, Miss Mercuriel, and Veery, Kai, and Mary, at my mommies, daddies, and guardians tier, and Gods and Punks and Agent Ness at our gods, goddesses, and deities tier. The novella is largely an explanation of the environment of Flatland before segueing into a recounting from A Square as he's in jail. It is important to note that we can and should read A Square, our protagonist, from the beginning as being an unreliable source of information. He's flawed by his upbringing, and we can tell this through the way he speaks of others and how he's characterized. The world. Now, it is specifically noted that Flatlanders do not call their home Flatland or even flat. They cannot see it as such and don't have a concept for what flat may be, since they've never seen the opposite. Within the world itself, there is a bit of gravity that pulls southward, referred to as a very faint force of attraction that's harder on women and the elderly than on healthy and robust males. This attraction is stronger the farther southward you go, so it is polite to give ladies the northward right of way. Surprisingly, they actually do have weather in terms of rain from the north, which honestly is likely condensation from their tiny shape meat bodies just falling down once enough person smog accumulates at the most northward top. Aside from that, weather and day cycles aren't especially a thing, or at least they're not talked about. Flatlanders know it is day when a light from some unknown origin floods the entire plane at once, and as one would expect, night is the absence of that light. No sunrise or sunset, and no need for windows to even let the light in. The source of light used to be a heavily debated topic among scholars, but it was outlawed in recent times. How recent isn't explained either, but this is our first introduction as readers to the habit that those in positions of power within Flatland have of trying to suppress knowledge and curiosity within their citizens. Houses, by and large, are pentagonal for their size, space, and lack of danger they pose, being that sharp houses in the shape of triangles or squares make it all too easy to maim yourself, as Flatlander sight is really bad, meaning it's incredibly easy to get hurt by simply bumping into things. Only military buildings are allowed to still be triangular, hostile architecture to keep the unqualified away. Finally, for the environment, the novella does describe trunks of trees, but doesn't exactly explain what they look like or how they grow. It can be assumed that trees and foliage are different in appearance from what we know, but since it isn't all that important to the story, it isn't elaborated on. The anatomy. Now this is heavily elaborated on. Flatlanders are very small compared to us. They only measure in matters of inches across, making them actually pretty cute to think about. You know, aside from the shape racism and political crimes. 11 inches is usually the largest a male's side can grow, with 12 being the absolute max. As far as I could tell, there's not a set position for their singular eye from shape to shape, though it is stated that triangles have eyes set closer to the center of their side and away from their vertex. We can probably assume a similar placement for other shapes. From there, it's implied that brains are closer to their northward angle, being the angle that feels more right when facing northward, by a passage where our protagonist, A Square's great-great-great-grandfather, was described as having an angle or brain of 59 minutes. Though that could just be a clever euphemism for the idea that intellect corresponds to angle, as we'll discuss later on. Though it's also said that some isosceles who have an angle of less than 1 degree are practically brain dead, and instead used as basically inanimate objects to teach children why it's important to obey the law and be morally good. You know, so your children don't become like that, which does imply that the brain is at the top angle. But more on that horror later. Shapes should always have equal side length as an assumed law of nature, and disparity in this is seen as a birth defect that will either result in medical augmentation, lowering of class, or death. Though we'll also discuss this later, irregularity is equated with immorality and criminality, and is always treated as such. This is our first foray into the ableism and classism of Flatlander society. One thing that I really appreciate about this book is the way it subtly, or not so subtly, slips messages condemning these facts of life to the reader. Even though our narrator, A Square, is usually on the side of written law, he, as someone the audience sees as absurd for blindly following such harsh doctrines, has his limits and expresses discomfort with certain practices we'll be going into. However, even when he's entirely huffing the Flatlander mentality paint fumes, we as readers still easily understand this book is not actually promoting the idea of sexism or prejudice through the sheer level of preposterousness being treated as normalcy. With that being said, The reasoning for refusing to allow irregular shapes in proper society cites the need to maintain the status quo as a reason irregulars are criminalized or euthanized. Surely you can't expect us to change our homes and government buildings to accommodate irregular shapes. That would be absurd. It would just take too much time and resources and would give far too much leniency for those inherently moral lessers to give even a shred of leeway. What? We should work to rehabilitate our disenfranchised and try to make spaces accessible and safe for everybody, no matter their shape or gender? They should be grateful if they're imprisoned for life on the government's dime instead of being killed on the spot. Yeah, this is meant to be an absurdist extreme, right? Not a reflection of the society we live in today? Oh boy. Funny enough, the writing does go out of its way to describe how irregulars are discriminated against from birth and watched so heavily by police, for example, that when they grow up, them being distrusting of the state and others is just a confirmation that irregularity is synonymous with immorality. Not that the way you treat someone as a criminal since birth might have an impact on how they act as they mature. Not funny, haha. Funny. I would like to get off Mr. Toad's wild ride of reflecting on the United States school-to-prison pipeline. Anyways, back to our anatomy lesson. Women are, of course, straight lines, and a son will always have one more side than his father, assumedly because they get it from their mother, meaning each generation raises in social status on a hereditary level. Don't worry, we'll get into shape, sides, and caste in a minute. I know, I keep saying we'll get back to it, but I promise we will. The addition of sides actually does not always happen to equilateral triangle tradesmen, and it happens even less frequently to the soldiers and workmen isosceles triangles. This is seen as a just law of nature because, as they don't have equal sides to begin with, they are seen as subhuman and do not deserve the raise in hereditary rank. I do wish the book discussed how Flatlanders actually breed, since like half its pages are dedicated to infodumping about how the universe works, but it was a novella from the Victorian times. Considering the small backlash we'll discuss in the women's section of this video that Abbott already received from the story's publication, I'm sure it would have been scandalous and salacious for a priest of all people to bring up how a line and a triangle make a square. But to go further into the hereditary class of shapes, we need to switch gears into social structure and caste system. The social caste system. The lowest recognized class of soldiers and workmen are isosceles triangles, with very steep angles, usually 12 inches in length and a base of ½ an inch. Some have such stark angles that they're mistaken for women, and what a terrible fate that would be. The middle class is made up of equilateral triangles as merchants and tradesmen. Then you have the professional men and gentlemen of squares and pentagons. The rank of nobility starts at hexagons up until you reach polygonal status, basically meaning you have more sides than there are prefixes for. When the sides become numerous enough that they cannot be distinguished by sight or touch, the shape is counted as a circle. Circles are the highest, most enlightened, priestly order of people in Flatland. They get their very own section toward the end of the exposition zone. How delightful. It is believed a father isosceles will always have another isosceles son as the right and just natural baseline. However, if they prove their worth in the military or are very smart, they may have a child that evens out in a few generations. Literally, it's believed within this world that your physical disability is due to a failing of you and your ancestors' morality. The idea is enforced by the little talked about criminal class, which are either irregular shapes, meaning shapes with either inequality in side length or improper angles that are, after being allowed to grow a bit to see if their irregularity will even itself out, either euthanized if their deformity is too great, surgically changed into a regular shape if it's possible, or left as the very lowest of the low civil servants if their deformity is within a reasonable margin. Additionally, within this criminal class are the children of isosceles that have angles of 1 degree or less, which are used as classroom aids to show why you must be a good and moral citizen, and are often not even fed or cared for, and instead replaced once they die around 30 days after birth, because feeding the assumed, and I cannot stress enough that word, brain-dead whelp and prolonging its life is said to be the more cruel option. We'll get into why that's a fat load a little later, because we still have to focus on why some triangles can breed out of their terrible station in life and some can't. As opposed to it being due to any actual moral failing or success, it's more likely that because soldiers and other isosceles triangles are seen as subhuman, and nobody within this Victorian society would want to allow their daughter to marry one of their kind, they usually could only marry and have kids with the daughters of other similarly low-ranking isosceles. Actually, it's not just likely, the circles literally create eugenics breeding pairs between daughters of other cusp isosceles triangles and the quote-unquote smart ones to help them breed true. Literally, they have certifications that a triangle has to get to prove they're equilateral, so that a high-standing lady, i.e. someone from the equilateral triangle class already, will ever agree to wed them. Our square protagonist laments this as foolish for reasons we'll again get into a bit later. Unfortunately, bearing an equilateral triangle as an isosceles does not give the parents any raise in station. Instead, equilateral triangles born from an isosceles brings about a days-long celebration, and the child being summarily stripped away from their deformed parents and given to a proper family. Usually a bachelor equilateral triangle with no children of his own. You know, to keep the bad morality from rubbing off on the kid and having them revert to bearing isosceles children of their own whenever they finally have them, instead of it being a genetic thing like the subtext all but confirms it to actually be.
Hi, editing Mark, who is also sick, stepping in to say something that he thought he put into the script itself, but being that this novella came out in 1834, it's important to note that the study of genetics wasn't really a science at this point. It wouldn't be until the 1850s when Charles Darwin and Mendel's research started circulating that genetics and molecular structure and DNA would really start to be researched and discovered in a more well-known sort of way. So the fact that it is written as someone of the 21st century, 22nd century, to be able to read this as, these things happen because of genetics, where that wasn't really a thing, is pretty interesting.
Furthermore, it's noted that it's seen as a good thing when an isosceles is occasionally born into a higher-ranking family, because it gives hope to the rabble living in squalor that their condition can happen to anyone, and supposedly prevents them from rising up in rebellion of their abhorrent treatment. Truthfully, the immorality makes your future children suffer rhetoric is just a way to keep them in place. By tying morality and goodness to physical configuration, the circle class can keep their lessers in subjugation by way of saying if they break the law by banding together with their superior numbers, sharp angles, and strengths to revolt against their poor treatment, it'll only make their sharp angle and two sides more pronounced. Meaning, if they try to advocate for better treatment of themselves by speaking against their betters, it'll ultimately result in them and their future children having a worse lot in life, no matter if that's true or not. With that being said, it's also stated that the isosceles seen as smart enough to even try inciting an insurrection are often bribed out of it by them suddenly being found to be equilateral with minor compression and surgical adjustments, thus permitting them into the ranks of other privileged classes. Will they genetically still be isosceles? Yes. Does that mean it's likely their children will also be isosceles? Also yes. But it'll just be seen as their own moral failing for ever thinking to speak out against their betters that caused their children to be born that way. It's just further proof. This only works because the entire world is taught that their configuration is tied to how they behave, and likely not really taught anything of genetics other than if you wed with an isosceles, that's seen as an act of basically bestiality, and so of course you'll likely have another deformed isosceles or irregular shape. Those triangles who are dubbed equilateral but still insist on rebelling or speaking out against the circular overlords, even with their newfound status, are institutionalized for life, because obviously there's something wrong with them mentally for not jumping at the chance to be a higher class. We love corruption! Though, it's important to note that even the sharpest isosceles with the smallest base is seen as on a higher social standing than any woman in terms of worth and intellect. You know, the class they called creatures, and less than human, the women. So, if isosceles triangles are seen as dangerous, women are seen as even more so. Soldiers are wedges, women are needles. All point at the extremities with the ability to become practically invisible at will if looking at you end on. So, what's the best way to keep a class of people who could easily overthrow those who pride themselves on being big and bulbous in power if they wanted to? Undertow? Why, put them down and oppress them while trying to keep them dumb, of course! It is obvious that A Square has a healthy fear of them and respect for their abilities to maim, even as he speaks down about females. Like, it's a great way to further characterize him as a valuable narrator. Women have their own eastern entrances for buildings so as not to hurt anyone when entering. Furthermore, a girl is not permitted to go out in public without emitting her peace cry, a shrill sound to let all around know that a woman is nearby. The penalty for failing to emit her peace cry is death. Additionally, any woman who gets sick with anything to cause involuntary movements, such as coughing and sneezing, is also to immediately be put to death. In a world with trees and a rainy season, you better just hope you never catch a cold, I guess. Some places where the southward attraction is greater also have a law that women must always sway their back end if they want to walk or even stand in a public place to indicate that she's there. This is only legislated in some places though, because it is seen as the inherently proper thing to do, and any lady worth her breeding will innately follow this swaying rule. Funny enough, it's implied that women from isosceles homes don't do this. Of course, it's stated as a slight against them not being proper women, but thinking about it, it's a sign of respect and slightly more equal social standing between the wedge-sharp triangles and their wives. Conscientiousness of peers who are always aware of the other's sharp points. It's stated that within these lower houses, there are often times of peace where women can do their housework without issues, even with their dangerous backside toward their husbands. However, it's said that there is never peace in the aristocratic houses, where such stringent rules are always to be followed and women are always reminded of their place. Mostly the lack of peace is claimed by the men to be because they hate how their dumb wives are always talking about nothing at all. But if anything, that more exemplifies the point. Again, it's oppression through societal convention. Otherwise, a woman should always be followed by a son or servant when in public, meaning she has no autonomy of being allowed out by herself. Or rather, she's always under observation, so it is impossible to discover the true nature of society. Some places within Flatland even condemn women to their homes forever, only allowing them to leave during religious festivals like their own damn wedding. However, these more strict laws are usually not set in place altogether, as, according to the government, being too stringent dulls the woman and increases the rate of domestic murders. I wonder why. Literally, there are cases where the entire male population of villages have been wiped out by women who are too oppressed and finally do break free. It feels like even though he's writing about all these restrictions on females, Abbott probably had a hefty respect for them, as this writing feels more reverent toward how a group of oppressed women will eventually rise against their oppressors in search of freedom. Fun fact, in 1884, he was accused of being a misogynist due to A Square's description of women and the novella being written in the first person, thus, of course, implying that those were the author's own views. Abbott published a foreword in later copies of the book where he says that the Square protagonist, quote, was written as a historian. He has identified himself, perhaps too closely, with the views generally adopted by Flatland, and as he has been informed, even by Spaceland historians, in whose pages until very recent times the destinies of women and of the masses of mankind have seldom been deemed worthy of mention and never of careful consideration. So I guess it's good to know that times haven't changed all too much, and the Twitter discourse of "you wrote a morally bad thing, so you must like that morally bad thing" has been around since forever. A Square obviously frames all of these very strict and sometimes deadly rules as, of course, for a woman's own good. Because obviously, if they stab someone, their frail feminine body will be shattered. So, suppression is for their own good, to protect them from their own dumb, overly emotional selves. Again, giving the assertion that their configuration as females is what inherently makes them more emotional and prone to outbursts instead of the impossibility that the social pressure put on them as women to keep others from hurting themselves on them and constantly being talked down to may ultimately chip away at their patience. It is written that women are devoid of reflection, forethought, and have hardly any memory to speak of. And because of this, and their dangerous configuration, it's actually encouraged for their husbands and fathers to keep women literally locked away inside their own little hole built into the house where, quote, you can do and say whatever you like to them, because, like a bird with a blanket over its cage, they won't even remember what you say or do to them, or even why they're mad moments later, because they're just so damn dumb. The lack of manners between lower-bred women and men is said to lead to massacre at times, though from the text it seems female outbursts of violence happen just about as often with other shapes. When it comes to tragedies within the isosceles communities, however, it's seen again as a good thing, because that results in a culling of the herd of undesirables. Even though an isosceles can hope with good morality and effort that their son will become an equilateral triangle, a woman can never change her station. Once a woman, always a woman. And nothing more. It is this fact of life that has men dictate that women have no brain power or recollection. You see, when I said the criminal class isosceles children are assumed to be brain dead, it is under this exact same notion. There's no actual evidence to prove that women can't think or are incapable of higher thoughts. In truth, a comment A Square makes about how he believed the barring of women being educated has dulled their minds over the past few generations implies the exact opposite. Instead, it is a self-fulfilling rule that men shouldn't feel bad about women's treatments because they're barely human, but they're barely human because of the manufactured law of life that women are inherently lesser. Women are not to be taught how to read or do math, and are specifically bred to be dumber and dumber. It's called the system of quietism, as in a woman is better seen for the shine and luster of her eye and not heard for her brainless babbling. Furthermore, we're told that men use entirely different sets of language when speaking to women than when speaking to other men, a way of placating them so the gender that has been molded into a less intelligent and reactionary life form won't lash out. You see, there's a big focus on emotional manipulation to keep women in their place on top of hefty legislation. They use emotional language like love, honor, duty, good, and evil with women, which are noted as not actually existing in the world of properly configured men. Love is what you do for benefits, and duty is simply your configuration. Those foolish womanfolk and their emotions. I really do enjoy that, at least in my reading of the text, it seems like Abbott, again, has a high respect for women as he goes out of his way to make the most outlandish and far-fetched rules for them to be governed by. As if women were given even the slightest inch of education or equality, it is a given that they would be able to overthrow the circles in power. I also love that A Square, in turn, lives in fear of what might happen if a woman ever learned how to read and read any of the, quote, normal, run-of-the-mill writings about the plane that discuss them as little more than breeding stock and a source of amusement. It all feels, unfortunately, too poignant even to this day, not gonna lie. Breeding pedigrees of women are kept in longer lineages than any show dog to boot. No woman can marry without a pedigree. Though, interestingly enough, the higher ranks of society tend to care less about the high-class breeding of a woman than the lower classes. A hexagon would never take a bride who had an irregularly shaped ancestor 5 generations back. but a dodecahedron might take one who has an irregular great-grandfather. Luster and soothing vocal tone are much more desired. And unfortunately, if they have a child with any birth defects, it's easier for a polygon to have the issue corrected with surgery or to have the child's existence covered up entirely than for the lower class. The art of sight recognition. Alright, I talked way too much on the previous sections, but knowing the backstory is very important for discussing why the films don't really work. However, I don't want this to be a 2-hour-long video, so I'll try to make this segment quick. Sight in Flatland is very simplified. The entirety of their plane is filled with a miasma called fog, and this fog helps aid those of the dimension by adding a bit of extra depth and ease when it comes to seeing someone's angle at a point. All lines look the same for certain shapes like triangles and squares, but they get smaller as the number of sides increases. This doesn't make seeing any less difficult, however, as a properly educated man should be able to tell an octagon from a hexagon by a single glance of a single angle. I made this little diagram years ago, but it still works pretty well enough to explain the gist of it. Ignore the coloring because that's its own separate thing we'll get into, but shown here is the way a triangle will have a more steep and sudden shading at farther edges than compared to a square, for example. So on, and with shortening sides for a pentagon and other shapes as they grow in hereditary rank, with a circle having the softest easing in of shadows with no visible points at their axis. Back to the notion of regularity or equality in side length, a great reason for evenness being seen as goodness is cited as having to do with sight recognition. You couldn't possibly understand someone's shape at a glance of their angle if they have even one uneven side. As an aside, the section talking about this says that intercourse would become perilous, and I'm left here to wonder if they mean shape sex or just intermingling would be dangerous. It's established shapes and lines are very sharp at any of their points, so it could kinda go either way. However, a Flatlander's sense of hearing is their first and foremost way of knowing another person's shape. There's a different tone of voice for the 3 lowest classes, excluding isosceles triangles, which are not counted as people even here, that's implied to be a social construct that the higher bred nobility have no interest in taking part in. Plebeian affairs, truly. Interestingly though, it is also stated that isosceles are very good at mimicking the timbre of another shape, even the robust roundness in tone of priests. Feeling is another way to know someone's shape, but it is frowned upon in polite society. Meeting someone for the first time is often done by asking to be permitted to feel someone, a veritable handshake, but it's only ever a single vertex that is felt. All else should be done by noting someone's sides from a single glance. The universal color bill. In present-day Flatland, everything is pretty dull, akin to a black void filled with stark white lines of other people and buildings. That wasn't always the case, however, when the practice of painting was a commonality. The ancient practice of painting referred to the act of coloring oneself with paints. Shocking, I know. Allegedly, it was invented long ago by a man who, upon discovering paints, first colored his house, then his slaves, then himself. Chromatistes was a visionary. Everyone could recognize him at a glance, no matter their level of education. Even the dumb, idiot womenfolk could tell his front from his back sides because of his different colorization. Even the isosceles, barred from higher learning institutes and greatly ignorant to the art of sight recognition, were able to recognize him at the fastest of looks. Painting quickly gained popularity by everyone in the lower class. And in the span of months from its discovery, even low-ranking nobility of dodecahedrons were painting themselves. The only ones to refuse the new fashion trend were, of course, the very highest ranks of nobility. However, even within a few generations, everyone within Flatland colored themselves, save for the highest priestly faction and, of course, dumb womenfolk by nature of the fact that circles and women only have one side, and thus wouldn't be able to paint their multiple sides differently like every other polygon. So, by making something like sight more accessible. Of course the people in power did not like that. The circles said that the scientific arts were even going out of style in this time, and that was dangerous to the intellect of future generations. In reality, the social stigma of sight recognition and the inaccessibility of it was there to be a barrier, so those seen as lesser and undesirable, like women, isosceles, and irregular shapes, had no level of equality in the slightest. Nothing they fully shared with the morally and socially superior regular men. Think of it this way. If sight recognition is for the smart, then genetically dumb people obviously can't do it. If it's made obsolete, then there's one less thing to hold above others, which could result in more of society and nature's truths being discarded, if not just called into question, and eventually resulting in a more equal society. The mentality of, if you give an inch, they'll take a mile, but applied directly to making life more accessible and easier for everybody. The time of color's heyday seems to be reminisced on and even craved for being actually visually interesting and making people feel alive. Soldiers would paint their three sides black, orange, and purple, and put on stunningly synchronized shows of military might for the public. People could paint their homes to have individual flair, and parties were no longer just these pensive functions filled with the introductions, "How do you do, Mr. So-and-so? Please permit me to feel and be felt by you." But instead, "Oh, how do you do? I've heard so much about you," and knowing someone at a glance. A dumb society is a placatable and easy to subjugate society. And having a barrier between who can and can't sight read another works in the upper echelon's favor. If sight recognition in the lowest classes, by way of color, if doing something dictated as impossible by the governmental and religious leaders of the world who create all of the rules based on their hereditary superiority alone is actually possible, then what other aspects of life have been falsely dictated as true? The lower classes were growing bold and questioning their place with this new accommodation, and even insisting that all classes should be equal. A large faction of low-ranking and even mid-ranking shapes led by an irregular circle that had been allowed to live grew, stating that women and circles can and should be painted as well, with their half with their eye and mouth being seen as their front side, and the other being the back. Both were to be painted red and green. And this group even proposed it as a bill to become a mandatory law, with an aim to embolden women by making sure they would always be treated with the same respect as the highest class, while also snubbing their noses at circles by having them painted as the lowest class. The circles did not like this idea in the slightest. It was a harsh pushback, a brazen idea to give the upper crusts a taste of their own medicine that would ultimately lead to the movement's downfall. It is said that during this time that many circles, who mind you are a fairly rare class at the top, were killed between rebellion and domestic disputes. So, what's the best way to stop a new form of self-expression and actualization in the populace as a whole? A moral panic, of course! I want you to listen to this and think about how it might relate to current-day politics, okay? It is said, and it's imperative to know that this is not concrete history, but instead seen as between a vague recounting of events wherein details vary from person to person, and a rumor, that an isosceles triangle painted himself with the 12 colors of a dodecahedron before going and trying to court the orphaned daughter of a high-ranking polygon. Because none of the normal checks of sight reading his angles or even feeling to make sure he was physically who he claimed to be were done, they were engaged, wed, and got as far as consummating their marriage before this wicked deception was discovered, at which point the poor girl took her own life, distraught to have been taken advantage of by the horrible, terrible, degenerate isosceles triangle. One could interpret the way this tale perfectly encompassed the issues circles obviously had with color being a dangerous sentiment as it being too good to be true. No, the issue isn't that accessibility for all means a more even playing field. We hate this because it puts our daughters in danger. Call me a conspiracy theorist, but it's easy to wonder if the story was entirely fabricated by the government. Because that's a pretty smart long con on the side of the isosceles if true. Something that the nobles implied would be impossible for a mere isosceles triangle to think up on his own with how idiotic they insist their race of shape to be. So, either you have to admit an isosceles is smart enough to trick everybody in high society, thus rendering the assertion that more sides means more brains an incorrect conclusion, or you have to assume that the whole thing was either entirely made up, or that a very intelligent polygon at the head of state was giving this isosceles orders like a puppet. But alas, in a society of thoroughbred idiots, the situation resulted in public outrage. Everyone was worried for their daughters. Women and girls were fearful that a disgusting imposter might assault them in disguise. Real dodecahedrons were enraged that their identities were being stolen. Now, if you said, that sounds a lot like the witch hunting that's going on with trans legislature right now, then I'll give you the prize that is recognizing this book is from 1884 and the political scapegoating tactics have not changed. Support of the color bill waned heavily, and many now openly rebuked the sentiment of colorizing yourself at all. Others only needed a slight nudge. And so, the chief circle held an assembly that was, in truth, a thinly veiled assassination setup for Chromatistes. It was announced that the Universal Color Bill would be made law, and Chromatistes was invited to give a speech, which is said to have been incredible, jaw-dropping, and have lasted the better part of a day before the chief circle then listed every single negative outcome that could possibly happen by signing this bill into law. Side note, in the book, now I might be dumb about this, but it's said that the leader of the coloration faction was an irregular circle, and also that Chromatistes was the leader of the sedition. So I think we can assume through Grecian logic that Chromatistes is an irregular circle here. Anyway, the reactionary women and tradesmen, and even isosceles in the audience, were convinced in the fact that if the criminal class that heavily outnumbered everyone else gained equality. You know, the class of people who are determined to be criminals because their sides differ by a margin or their angle is too sharp. They would surely take control and impose the same horrible conditions they were forced to live under on all others, as well as noting that no marriage would ever be safe again because women don't have the brain power to properly determine shape on their own. With color, all men were losing their ability to sight recognize and feel the true shape of others after all. Chromatistes, who was already being held against his will and not allowed to offer solutions to proposed problems at this point, was assassinated by the soldiers surrounding him. Soldiers who were in turn killed by the women in the audience as they were told to back up and make way, surely just coincidentally being near the men who might have been able to tell tales of the premeditated political murder. The women didn't die as they were aided by the circular generals in the audience, but after that, it was absolute carnage. A massacre. It extended further and became a bit of a cleansing of where the government officials could declare any triangle to be irregular and connected it to the horrible events without needing to even measure them. Meaning, many even suspected of slightly disliking their station in life were slaughtered. The irregulars who had experienced a short freedom from being taken as either prisoners for their irregularity, sent to schools as learning materials to be starved or cold were once again claimed by the state. And of course, finally, color was entirely abolished and outlawed for the sake of the citizens. But fret not, gentle listener, it's allowed in some very high university courses and, of course, for high-ranking nobles to use even still. But the marching morons of the lower class are not allowed to even speak of color or paint. Only one person in the whole of Flatland knows the art of making paints, and that is, of course, the Chief Circle, who hands it down on his deathbed to his successor. Those who create it are sequestered to one workshop, never allowed to leave, and are killed annually and replaced by new craftsmen, so the secret doesn't ever get out. So, why don't we finally talk about those social upper crusts at the top echelon of the world? The circles. We now enter the final bit of exposition before discussing our actual main character and story. I promise. Circles are known as the priestly faction and make up the ruling class whom decide everything that goes on within Flatland. From morality to military to law to order, you name it, and a circle has decided how it should be. They don't lift a finger themselves to do anything, but they still retain absolute control. Attend to your configuration. It is the foremost law priests uphold within Flatland society. Keep your nose clean and stay within the means your sides have granted you. Much like the Catholic, peace be with you and also with you, or the Jedi's, may the force be with you, or even the French ça va, the saying is so ingrained in society that it is a greeting, an order, and a response all in one. The chief circle responsible for the outlaw of color, surprisingly, and I do hope you can hear the sarcasm, was the one to not only coin the term, but also the idea that configuration makes the man. Further, meaning that irregularity inherently makes someone immoral, thus making any action carried out by a high-ranking enough person completely moral and within their rights, no matter how heinous it may be, meaning any right action carried out by the disfigured criminal class is a mere attempt to further manipulate or fool those around them into believing they have the capacity to do good. But also remember, good and evil don't exist. Those are silly emotional words for talking to women. It's just configuration. Why praise a square for doing well when it is in truth his rightness and angle that preordained him to do such? Why reprimand an isosceles for being mischievous when it's in his nature as an incorrectly formed and physically immoral creature that predisposed him to act in such a way? If it's only in their nature to steal, for example, then it's only the natural order that the creature should be sentenced to death for giving in to his configuration. You have no free will, and your lot in life is predetermined by your configuration and birth. It is always assumed that the chief circle has at least 10,000 sides, though that's more of a title of nobility than a surefire truth of life. In reality, it's not easy to just math out a polygon's number of sides, as after a point, a polygon's sides increase exponentially with each generation instead of with a simple +1. With this incremental increase in hereditary rank, however, also comes a reduction in fertility. In part due to this fact and the unknowing nature of how many sides your child would have, the art of medicine is often used for a bit of evil. It is important here to return to an earlier topic we discussed in the anatomy section, that circles are actually just polygons with very many incomprehensibly small sides. However, what I neglected to mention is that the art of feeling, as defined earlier in the video, to try and actually discern the number of sides a circle has, is actually forbidden. Perhaps that is how Chromatistes was able to live for so long, especially if we consider the possibility that his father was likely a high-ranking circle to be able to hide his presence for the majority of his life. But I digress. Infant polygons on the cusp of circularity are very fragile, and their sides can be fractured quite easily. So it is not uncommon for a parent to have their child basically crushed like a boiled egg you're rolling across a hard surface to crack the shell off of, just so it may heal in a way that grants it more sides. Hopefully, meaning it'll give birth to children with even more sides in the future. Again, that's the issue of not teaching your people about genetics. Breaking their sides doesn't mean they're genetically that shape. It just means that they themselves will have a higher standing and that their children will have the social stigma of not having even more sides, meaning that they carry their parents' assumed immorality with them. And this process results in a roughly 9 out of 10 infant mortality rate among the higher classes who already have fewer children than even the average Pentagon. Alright, so ultimately, why does all of this world building even matter? Sure, it's interesting and a bit painful when you look at the ways some aspects of present-day society reflect this fictional and negatively exaggerated society, but otherwise, I believe it's so that you can go into the story with an informed perspective on society. The characters are the way they are, not just because that's just how they are, but because that's how society has conditioned them to be. More modern writing may find ways to work this exposition into the story in a more show-don't-tell sort of way instead of 2 hours worth of exposition in a 4-hour audiobook, but this may have been Abbott's best idea for getting across exactly what he wanted world-building-wise. The characters think and act in certain ways that conform directly to this world's social structure, and knowing the ways their lives have pressured and molded them can add a bit more impact to their choices. Speaking of characters, the protagonist. The protagonist of the novella Flatland is a gentleman dubbed A Square, if you didn't already get that. He is a polite and proper lawyer who we know to be a bit pompous from his descriptions of the world around him. He always attends to his configuration and side-eyes others who do not conform to society as well as he does, likely because he is the grandchild of an isosceles triangle. This sheds a new light on his comment of why one would even need a certification to prove being an equilateral triangle, when the birth of a square should be proof enough, making it all the more poignant. If his own father was assumed to also be isosceles, he would not have been taken from his family as a child in the way that we learned about earlier. He would have seen firsthand the stigma that comes from being so closely related to an isosceles. He likely saw his father experience prejudice for his parentage vis-a-vis people asking if he was truly equilateral and even demeaning him. Now, why would we even assume A Square's father was mistaken as an isosceles in the first place? Why? Because the novella has a whole passage about his great-great-great-grandfather's pride and how he was mistaken for an isosceles when being felt by another. Not due to folly in the other's shape feeling of his angle, but due to a rheumatic fit causing him to injure a polygon who was feeling him for the first time, resulting in imprisonment and being reclassified as an isosceles. Because of his immorality in disability and showing a symptom, when A Square's great-great-grandfather was born, he was dubbed an isosceles of 58 degrees as punishment, in spite of his true measurements. Now, why would this mean that A Square's father was misclassified as an isosceles? This is mostly speculation based on the writing, but I believe A Square's own adoration for his grandfather is the biggest piece of evidence implying this. Not only due to nepotism or the often seen tendency people with prejudices have to see their family or friends of the marginalized class as one of the good ones, but the fact that his father had contact or knowledge of him whatsoever gives us the biggest hint. I have heard that my excellent grandfather, one of the least irregular of his unhappy isosceles class, who indeed obtained shortly before his disease 4 out of 7 votes from the Sanity and Social Board for passing him into the class of equal-sided, often deplored with a tear in his venerable eye a miscarriage of this kind, which had occurred to his great-great-great-grandfather, a respectable working man with an angle or brain of 59 degrees. The fact that he would and even can tell his own child of what a great man his grandfather was, implies that due to the infallible nature of those in power, and the fact that no equilateral triangle could ever be allowed to grow with his disgustingly deformed isosceles parents, A Square's father was already born and similarly classified as an isosceles in spite of his own equal measurements. It was not until A Square's own birth that his father may have been reclassified as equilateral and the social stigma removed. Perhaps this is why the sphere we meet later in the story even chose A Square as a prophet of the third dimension. A man who'd already seen the folly of his society firsthand would be a bit more likely to believe in higher dimensions and the fact that his people may wish to snub any attempts at contradicting their doctrine. Which makes the fact that A Square's close relation to an isosceles triangle is ignored by every single adaptation all the more irritating. Unfortunately, when you get down to it, most of the information we just discussed is not utilized in any of the movies. So I guess let's get on to what we might better be able to align between film and book. The plot. Just as forewarning, I'm gonna be reciting the plot summary from Course Hero and just adding details that I think are important, because all things considered, we get most of our characterization of A Square from his earlier exposition monologues and the description I gave of him just now. After all, the plot of the novella takes up less than half of the book's runtime. Even before the exposition half of the novella, we're introduced to A Square after having spent many years already imprisoned, trying to spread the ideology of 3 dimensions to his captors and yet failing no matter his efforts. It's then that we look back on his life and the nights before the new millennium that led him to this point. Our protagonist, A Square, is the most everyman of everymen in Flatland, a square who attends to his configuration fairly well. However, that all begins to change once he dreams that he travels to a realm made of a single straight line and converses with its king. A Square believes he's explaining his world of 2 dimensions clearly, but the king of Lineland, for whom men are lines and women are single points and whom all other people appear as a single dot, cannot understand. Furthermore, nothing A Square does can convince him. The king, frustrated with A Square's claims, commands his subjects to attack, though A Square awakens before they're able to strike. The next night, A Square attempts to teach his orphaned Hexagon grandson a lesson in sight recognition by placing 9 blocks in a 3x3 grid. The Hexagon thinks for a moment before proposing the idea of a new point, and of what a grid of 3x3x3 might entail. That if there were some hypothetical way to fill the area of a square further, it would be a square of 3 inches every way. A Square, perturbed by this dangerous thinking, sends the Hexagon to bed after scolding him as a fool. It is then that he's visited by Sphere, who first corrects A Square that his grandson is no such thing, before explaining that he has come to Flatland to share the gospel of 3 dimensions. As he tries to explain solid space, Sphere moves through Flatland, visible as an expanding and contracting circle. He describes dimensions through geometric progression and pure math. He moves things from inside locked cabinets and presses on A Square's interior to try and demonstrate that he is above the space. Ultimately, A Square does not believe him until Sphere pulls him out of Flatland altogether and shows him the dimension from above. A Square then worships Sphere as a wise, divine teacher and becomes a bit of a simpering mess. Sphere shows A Square the council chambers, where his very own brother, a perfectly symmetrical square and the chief clerk of the High Council, is drafting a measure to suppress knowledge of the 3rd dimension. Whereas the states have been troubled by ill-intentioned persons pretending to have received revelations from another world, and professing to produce demonstrations whereby they had instigated to frenzy both themselves and others, it had been for this cause unanimously resolved by the Grand Council that on the first day of each millenary, special injunctions be sent to the prefects in the several districts of Flatland to make strict search for such misguided persons, and without formality of mathematical examination, to destroy all such as were isosceles of any degree, to scourge and imprison any regular triangle, to cause any square or pentagon to be sent to the district asylum, and to arrest anyone higher rank, sending him straight away to the capital to be examined and judged by the council. Sphere, seemingly either acting on higher orders or to fulfill a prophecy, manifests in the chambers and attempts to convince the attendees to share the gospel of the 3rd dimension with the rest of Flatland. The highest circle in attendance notes that the archives, which only he has access to, told of this happening at the beginning of each millennia past, and seems largely unfazed as he orders the council to dispose of the isosceles guards present and arrest A Square's brother for witnessing it. Afterwards, the difference between solids and flatlanders is explained further to A Square, as solids, like the sphere, being a circle composed of multiple other circles, and further demonstrates this by stacking cards on top of one another until a cube is formed. The sight repulses A Square because it seems irregular to his eyes, but Sphere claims that's only because his eyes aren't accustomed to seeing any form of depth in light and shade. Sphere then introduces an odd A Square to a cube, and upon gaining further understanding understanding and hungering for more knowledge, A Square asks Sphere to show him the fourth dimension. Now, here the summary says that Sphere becomes angry, saying that there is no such thing. And maybe it's a difference in interpretation, but honestly, Sphere seems more frustrated that this freaky little corn chip wanted to see and touch his insides so adamantly, and that carried over to his denial of the fourth dimension. He does seem agitated and even tries to dissuade A Square, but after he gives a fairly good analogy of what a fourth dimension could be, he concedes. In one dimension, did not a moving point produce a line with two terminal points? In two dimensions, did not a moving line produce a square with four terminal points? In three dimensions, did not a moving square produce, did not this eye of mine behold it, that blessed being, a cube with 8 terminal points? And in 4 dimensions, shall not a moving cube, alas for analogy and alas for the progress of truth, if it be not so, shall not, I say, the motion of a divine cube result in a still more divine organization with 16 terminal points? Behold the infallible confirmation of the series 2, 4, 8, 16. Is not this a geometrical progression? Is not this, if I might quote my Lord's own words, strictly according to analogy? The Sphere actually grants him that it is a hypothesized theory, but since nobody can come to a consensus on it or even provide proof, they should leave such speculation for the moment and focus on the 3D matter at hand. Only when A Square refuses to do as he says and talk about the third dimension and discuss how to spread the word to his fellow Flatlanders, instead further focusing on the desire for knowledge higher than the understanding of Sphere's own, did he actually get mad and ultimately return A Square to Flatland. Being smart for once, Square decides to keep the whole ordeal a secret for the moment and lies about having fallen into some newly fashioned cellar instead of being yoinked out of the dimension when his wife asks where he went. A Square then has another dream vision in which he and Sphere visit a world made of a singular point that thinks it's the whole universe. Neither can convince the egotistical little being that other people even exist, foreshadowing the difficulty A Square will have convincing anyone of the third dimension. However, he does later try to convince people with reason, despite the legal prohibition, until in frustration he tells his entire story and is thrown into prison. His prison memoirs are the book Flatland. Okay, good lord, we're finally done talking about the book. Going back through the novella and writing these, 30 pages thus far has been incredibly fun for me. Hyperfixation go burr, sure, but mostly this story is such an interesting piece of social commentary and even an amazing piece of evidence showing how much of a flat circle time truly is. A flatland circle. Anyway, make sure to come back tomorrow to hear me talk about the horrible movie adaptations and why they almost all, are terrible.